All right, we are live and ready to go. This is exciting. This is our second YouTube live event, and my name is Walter Adams. I am one of the faculty and residents here at San Jose State University. We also have Dr. Etienne Brown. Go ahead and introduce yourself, Dr. Brown. You're on mute, Dr. Brown. It's okay. It's been a long day for all of us. You're still on mute, Dr. Brown.
Sorry, I've been on Zoom so much today that I feel Zoom is like preventing me from speaking because it's heard enough of me. But welcome everyone. I'm Etienne Brown. I'm a philosophy professor and I'm a faculty in residence. And I'm very happy to join Dr. Adams, also known as Walter. And today and tonight we have a very special guest who is another doctor. So Dr. Williams, also known as Zoe. So Zoe is a PhD in political science, and she's also my partner here at SGSU. So we're here to talk about voting, and we decided to invite Zoe because Zoe has been involved in local politics a little bit in the last year. And that has allowed her to gain a lot of information about the kind of local proposition that are going to be on the ballot. So we thought it'd be interesting for you to, for us to discuss whether those propositions to kind of just understand what they are and what's at stake, and also depending on how many of you join us live to ask her directly question that she can answer. Do you want to say a few words about yourself, Zoe? You're also on mute.
No, I think you covered it pretty well. I would just add that, yeah, in addition to having a PhD in international relations, so not, local politics, not American politics, I'm just someone who's interested in politics and moving here last year. I'm a US citizen, but this is the first time I lived in the US. So I thought, this is a pretty big year politically for the country. It would be cool to get involved. So I've been volunteering for a local campaign since about this time last year. And I've just also been involved in some more social justice-y stuff. And that's been a really great window into some of the local issues in San Jose and Santa Clara in the Bay Area, and particularly I think some of these ballot measures. This is a new thing for me. Nowhere that I've lived before has had these kinds of sort of direct democracy ballot kind of propositions, and so I think it's really an interesting process and a way of getting your voice heard on really important issues. I think this is such a big presidential election year. Everyone's super focused on what's happening nationally, but because we're in such a blue or Democratic stronghold, your vote for president does matter to some degree, but I think you can have a much bigger impact, and we'll talk about this more, I'm sure, later, when you're voting on those down ballot races, when you're voting on local propositions, because those are things that are going to affect us really directly, and your vote is going to have a bigger impact there than when we're talking about what's happening federally. So yeah, I guess you'll hear from me in a little while on some specific ballot measures that I think are interesting and probably most relevant for you guys.
Awesome. We're certainly looking forward to that. And yeah, I think you highlight a really good point just with how the Electoral College is set up. Our state's presidential choices probably, don't take anything for granted, but probably pretty clear at this point. But certainly down ballot measures and races have a large impact on our immediate well-being, and will be great to talk about that in more detail. But I think we would first start tonight with sort of sharing some thoughts on the larger social justice context and lens that we find ourselves in sort of across this election cycle. The Black Lives Matter movement has been so vibrant and robust over these past several months, and still continues to call for much needed change against institutionalized racism and systems of oppression for many people. And I wanted to briefly share a little bit of my own personal story as a half white, half African American individual. These issues strongly resonate with me, as well as I know Etienne and Zoe, who are allies to this cause. But speaking to all San Jose State Spartans, really, this election is such a referendum, or an opportunity to have a referendum on many of these social justice issues, whether it's matters of police brutality or issues of violence or the killing of innocent Black people, against white supremacy. These are all sort of cornerstone issues that we can take an opportunity to address with our vote, with our ballot. And so as you consider the various choices you have before you, do not sit out this election. Do not take your vote for granted. It was not so long ago when the opportunity to vote was much more in danger with regards to the types of oppression that were being thrust upon people of color. And even today, we see many different measures. They might be subtler in their character, but ways to limit voter oppression, voter opportunities to vote. So voter oppression initiatives across the country are being fought in in court cases as we speak. To give some perspective, my own family, my great-grandfather actually ran for elected office, but was shot at for trying to run for local office in Mississippi. And so, this was in a very different time where, the civil rights era was being sparked, but this is still something that, today we can safely go to a ballot box. Now, we are threatened by a global pandemic, which also is a huge concern that we should all be very aware of. But certainly there are safety precautions that we should all take if you decide to go vote in person, to wear a mask, and to practice social distancing. These are two very simple things that you can do to make sure that if you go to vote in person, or even as you go to drop off your ballot, that you are not congregating close to other individuals in large crowds. All it takes is one super spreader event for your life to be at risk. And so we can't emphasize that enough, but we definitely want to encourage you to vote safely, and to take the appropriate precautions when you go do so. And we are here as resources for you, whether you have questions tonight, tomorrow, or in the days and weeks ahead. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us via email or attend our upcoming events, which we will mention at the end of this. But with that, I will shift things over to Dr. Brown, and he can share some of his thoughts on the upcoming election.
Well, first of all, Walter, I want to thank you. I think it's like a very touching story about your family. But what I especially liked about what you said is that I think you're helping us see that going to the polls and deciding to vote can be part of a much broader conception of what it means to be a democratic citizens and to fight for social justice, right? So voting is a chapter of that, but I think that for you especially, and I think it's true for our residents also, it can be one thing that you do, one thing among a larger set of things that you decide to do. If you decide to walk or stand with people engaged in Black Lives Matter process, that can be one part of your democratic citizenship. So democratic citizenship is not just about voting. That's really something that I think it's important to underline. I do think that I do want to discuss voting today with you two and with residents, because I think that it's but one chapter of democratic citizenship, but it's an important one. And you've already started doing the work of reminding us why it's important, and that and reminding us that, you know, being allowed to vote and being that right is not something that we should take for granted. So what I wanted to do before we jump in some local propositions with Zoe, because I really think she's the person who's going to be to help us see through that. I just wanted to discuss a little bit what are the kind of reasons that we have to vote, because I think that right now residents and students are hearing a lot, go vote, go vote, go vote. It's important to vote, but they don't always have necessarily the time to discuss with their peers and with others what are the main reasons that they have to vote, because I actually think that you have multiple reasons to vote and multiple reasons to believe that you should take the time to go to the polls or to send in your ballot by mail. So I'm gonna try to cover five. I like doing top fives, you know, already. So I'm gonna try to do top 5 reasons of why I think that you should go vote, and hopefully we can discuss that a little bit. So I think that the first reason to vote is the most straightforward. It's because you might want to change the outcome. Whether you agree or you disagree with the person who's currently sitting in the White House, I think that this is one of the days that you have a chance to influence the outcome. So that's the first reason. That's the obvious one. But I want to go below and beyond that. I want to go beyond that today, because often I hear students say things like, you know, California is a blue state. Whether or not I go vote, it's going to be a blue state anyway. So my voice don't matter. And I think that we have to move beyond that to remind ourselves that you actually have other reasons to vote. So, you know, you might have heard this, but a second reason to vote is that voting allows you to express yourself. And expressing yourself is an important part of showing others who you are, right? Like when you put a sticker of your favorite of your favorite sports team on your car, or the university you belong to, no one is going to say, well, why are you doing that? You're not changing the outcome. Like the point where you do that is just you just want to show others that you believe in something strongly. And that's perfectly normal to do. And you should be proud to be a Spartan, and you should be proud of what you believe in. So I think that you know, going to vote also has this kind of expressive function where you're just letting others know, even if you just put it in an urn, what you believe in. And I think that's a very important part of, you know, being a young adult. Beyond that, and Walter already touched on that, and I think it's extremely important to mention that. I think that when you go vote, especially you, given the demographics of resident and students at SJSU, I think that when you go vote, you're promoting diversity and making sure that a variety of voices are being heard. If you look at the statistics of who votes in the United States, people who tend to vote are primarily white people, and older people tend to vote more than younger people. So if you are a young person that is also non-white, and again, a lot of our residents and a lot of our students at ZSU belong to this category, I think that you're making sure that your voice can be heard, and you're kind of making sure that the person that's going to be elected and the proposition that going to pass, those decisions are going to reflect the view of the entirety of the population, not just a kind of subset of the population. And I think that promotes democratic health. It's something that we need to do. We need to encourage people to go to the urn to make sure that the decisions that are being made represent everyone. Not just people of a certain age group, not just certain people of a racial background. So I think that that's one thing to keep in mind. The fourth reason why I think that that you should go vote relates again to what Walter has said, is that I think that we should not take democracy for granted. I think that democracy is something that we have to cherish and to maintain every day. And part of doing that is going to the urn to make sure that the voter turnout is going to be really good, so that no one, no matter who wins the election, will be allowed to say, oh, if they lose, this election is not that important. Look at how few people voted, or something like that, right? We want to have a kind of a healthy, a body of citizens that massively go to the urns, so that the winner of this election and the different proposition that passes, then we can look at them and say, no, look how many people voted. This is really the voice of the people. And this is really what people want in this country. And I think that this is going to give legitimacy to the result. And I think that given what's been happening in the last 5 years or so, it's extremely important that we remind ourselves that Democracy is something that it's an ideal that we have to live up to, something that we have to cherish. It's something that we have to protect, and it's something that if we're not careful enough, can slip away, and it has slipped away in history. Walter, it seems like you have something to say about this.
Yeah, no, I think these points are great, and I know it's hard in a virtual format, but believe it or not, we love to have lively discussion and great conversation, and we engage we hope our audience also will take part. So don't be shy. But I think Etienne brings up a great point about not taking things for granted and sort of adding legitimacy to the election, because no matter who wins, they are going to probably to some degree say that this is a mandate and a referendum of what the people want. They usually don't have time or sometimes the desire to look at the nitty-gritty details of, oh, only 30% voted or 40% voted or whatever it was, or 10% voted, right? So whether or not you vote, that will be lost in sort of the big news headline. It'll just be so-and-so won, and you want to be part of that conversation. And how you're part of that conversation, unless you happen to have connections at MSNBC or one of the major outlets, is you vote, and then you know that you are contributing to that discussion. So I'm really glad that Etienne brought that up, because just as he was saying, I could just hear all the times, no matter which party or which candidate, one is like, this was a referendum, this is a clear decision, even if it was by like 0.1%, it's like, this was a clear decision by the people. So like, have your voice be in there, and have that be part of this story in the larger narrative of the election. Back to you, Etienne. I just want to jump in there.
I think Zoe wanted to say something.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that you're right that in this country and in a lot of other countries that are sort of a multicultural or multi-ethnic society, like older white people tend to be the most frequent voters, and people of color, younger people tend to be low propensity voters. And we can look at those statistics and take that on their face value, but we also have to remember like the long history of voter suppression in this country and like attempts to specifically keep certain groups of the population from voting. But I also think it's really important, if you fall into one of those categories that's been, historically disenfranchised, of course, you shouldn't shoulder that whole burden yourself, and things like long voter lines and unfair ID requirements are all, it's not fair. But I think it's really important for young people, especially if you have the time, if you have the ability to go vote, just to, try and get back at those people, for lack of like a, better word, that keep you from voting, right? Because there's a reason that those groups have been historically disenfranchised. There's people in power who don't want to share that power. And I'd also just note that it's incredibly easy to vote in California. You should have that ballot in your mailbox. There's drop boxes on campus. You don't have to stand in any line at another time. Walter may be showing something to the camera, but the Zoom background's kind of ruining whatever effect that might be having. So I just wanted to briefly interject and make those points, but I know you have one more in your top 5. So
yeah, I mean, the final point, just going to tie back to what both of you said. I just think that you can vote for social justice, right? And here's what I had in mind when I say that. It's that if you don't vote, and then the person that ends up being elected, or the laws that pass, you think are actively promoting injustice in society, someone can go to you and say, well, you kind of didn't do nothing to prevent it. So voting is a way of defending yourself against those kind of ideas. That you can say, no, I voted, I stood up for what I believe in. And although I disagree, maybe some laws that you disagree with are going to be passed eventually, at least you can say, I did everything I could. I did my best to stand up to what I believed in. I did my part. And then, some of you, again, as we said earlier, some of you voting might be one part of the democratic citizenship, but that's an important part. And it's something that you can use to feel proud of standing for what you believe in, and just feeling that you've contributed politically to this country, so that if ever the results are not the ones that you were expecting, at least you can live with yourself and tell yourself, well, you know what, I did my part. And I think that that's also very important to think about. So those are the top 5. No more top 5 for tonight, for tonight's event. So this is what I wanted to say to you, and I suggest, unless Walter, you have something else that you'd like to share, I was going to suggest that we move on to maybe a discussion of local proposition, because as we said at the beginning of the event, it's hard to kind of understand them. You've probably seen some ads while watching TV, if you're like me. Sometimes those ads can be misleading. They don't give you the whole part of the story. Sometimes the very proposition that are on the ballot are kind of a little bit technical and difficult to understand. So I think that our objective can just be tonight to just, like, no matter what your political preferences are, to just demystify the ballot, so that you understand a little bit more what you're voting against or in favor of. And I think that, the best person to walk you through that is definitely Dr. Williams.
I'm very excited to hear what she has to say. I wanted to just quickly make one last point, because Etienne, again, I love this top 5 list. Very catchy, very convenient. And it's something that I think is sometimes overlooked, but the idea of, doing all you can, of, some people want to go out and protest, some people want to share resources, some people want to donate, some people want to vote, some people can do multiple of those things. And when you vote, maybe you vote for a certain initiative or candidate and they don't quite win. Maybe it was a close race, but they ended up losing. Maybe, of course, that doesn't feel great for, the thing you voted for, it didn't succeed. But I think it's also healthy to think about that from a larger perspective, because I don't think that there's been an election where, that I participated in, where there 100% of the eligible people voted, right? And when you see a close election or a close initiative, that can be very inspiring to your base, to whoever you're affiliated with, to your support group. And if they're like, wow, it was only like 5% difference, like, I should have voted, right? And then you can spark this chain reaction where it's like, well, we didn't pass this bill this time, or we didn't get this candidate elected this time, but next time, right? It sort of reinvigorates the group. And that can be a rallying cry. Whereas if everyone's just like, well, it doesn't matter, and well, look, see, we got 5% of the vote. Well, yeah, that's because you're not trying, right? So I think there's a really important lens to see that as inspirational as you carry your vote. But enough of me talking, enough of Dr. Brown talking. Our guest speaker is here, Dr. Zoe Williams.
Hi, okay. I do want to just say one other thing about why you should vote. And I want to try and make this sort of nonpartisan, but I think it's going to be pretty clear what I'm getting at here. So, whatever. Which is that a lot of people, I think, a lot of younger people were hoping for a different outcome for the Democratic primary, right? And we got a kind of centrist old white dude running for president again. And I think a lot of people might feel like, okay, we didn't get the kind of progressive policies that we were hoping for, or sort of champion for those types of policies. So what's even the point of voting? And I would just argue against that view and say that, think about who you're, and this is not my idea. This is definitely something I read on Twitter from someone, smarter, more socially engaged than me. But, they said, who do you want your enemy to be, right? Who do you want to be fighting against? Do you want to be fighting against someone who doesn't believe maybe one of your biggest concerns is even a real thing? Or do you want to be fighting against someone who believes in science, for example, might have a slightly more conservative approach than you do, but is still at least willing to listen? I think there's a kind of tendency for some people on more extreme sides of the political spectrum to think change is only going to happen when we burn it all down and sort of start anew. So, and I think that's a really not a great, not very pragmatic and maybe even dangerous idea. And sort of fighting with an open-minded centrist is probably better than fighting with a more extreme person. So I think probably everyone understands what I'm getting at here, but I just think that we shouldn't be too disappointed with the results and say, okay, we didn't get everything we wanted, so we're just going to drop out. I think it's important to stay engaged. And again, that's the only way you can make your voice heard in this process, which is, a cliche, but it's also true. Okay, so all of that aside, then some of these local props, there's some really interesting stuff on the ballot actually this year. I'm really interested in this, as I already said. This is a new kind of thing for me. It's rare to have these kinds of direct democracy opportunities on a ballot, by which I mean you can actually vote yes or no on a specific policy instead of voting to elect someone who's going to hopefully enact the kinds of policies you want, right? That's something you have in California, we have in California. I think it's pretty cool. So I'm going to go, it's not 5, I think it's top 7 of the most interesting ballots or ballot propositions, but I'll try and go quickly, or at least succinctly through them. So the first one is Prop 15, the first one I find interesting, and that's schools and communities first. And what it's proposing to do is closing certain corporate tax loopholes. So that doesn't mean raising taxes. It just means making it more difficult to avoid taxes for corporations only, so large businesses. And that's targeting actually a really small percentage of the businesses in the area, and doesn't include farmers, just so in case anyone's worried about the agricultural sector. But what it will do is basically raise billions of dollars for schools and other community programs. So that's that ballot, and or that's that proposition. Yeah, Etienne?
What I'm going to do when we discuss the ballot is not give my opinion, but just ask clarificatory question just to make sure that I understand, because there's a lot of stuff that I don't understand on that stuff. So basically what you're saying is that Proposition 15 would mean that some corporations would pay more taxes, and then that money would be used to fund education. Is that a good reconstruction of what you said, or am I missing part of the picture here?
No, that's it. But again, I want to emphasize this isn't about actually raising tax rates on corporations. It's simply making it more difficult for them to avoid paying the taxes they're already meant to be paying. And so supporters of the proposition say, again, it will raise billions of dollars that will be specifically directed at schools and other community programs. So those in favor of it tend to be a wide range of community groups, social justice groups, Democratic politicians, Democratic associations. Is largely opposed by like the Republican, California Republicans and some other groups like that. So that's the first one I think is super interesting, has a really clear impact on San Jose, on our city and other cities like this. Yeah, in the, I was about to say province because I'm Canadian, in the state. Okay, so the next one that I think is super interesting is Proposition 16. It's called Opportunity for All. And it's, I think, pretty controversial because what it's proposing to do is restoring affirmative action policies that were actually repealed by an earlier proposition. So in 1996, California voters passed a law that prevents public programs from using affirmative action when making decisions about education and public employment. So basically, who's getting hired in these public offices. So these agencies are now not allowed to consider a person's race, gender, or ethnicity. And I think that on its face sounds fair, but I think we also know that certain groups face, challenges, barriers to entry into a lot of institutions. And affirmative action is meant to make institutions that serve the public look a little bit more like the population that they're serving, I would argue. And better reflect the diversity of our population. This one, again, is supported by a lot of Democratic politicians, Democratic organizations, community groups, and is opposed also by many community groups and the Republican Party. So this one's pretty interesting. Affirmative action is super controversial. Etienne, do you want to weigh in?
Well, just when you're done discussing this proposition, I just wanted to do a quick recap. Maybe we can do it now. So Proposition 15, if you vote yes, that means that it's going to be harder for corporations to evade taxes, correct? Because sometimes, just knowing whether you should vote yes or no is not that easy to tell when you look at the ballot. And then the one you're discussing is 16. So yeah. If you vote yes on 16, that means that affirmative action is going to be restored in certain organization where it couldn't be used.
Precisely, yeah. So specifically for like public organizations, so public universities, government agencies, and so on.
Okay.
So yeah, so voting, if you vote yes on Prop 6, what you're doing is voting to restore affirmative action.
And if you vote yes on Prop 15, then you're supporting schools?
Yes.
Okay. All right. I'm just,
yeah.
They are worded very, very like double negatives, triple yeses, all the things.
Yeah, and I think that's on purpose. Okay, so the next one that I think is really interesting is Proposition 17, which is free the vote. And what that's doing is restoring the right to vote for formerly incarcerated people. So you guys may or may not be aware that if you've been in prison, often you actually aren't allowed to vote again. Even once you're out of prison, once you've, quote unquote, paid your debt to society, served your time, you still aren't able to vote. And so what this is doing is just saying, hey, that's not fair, and restoring the right to vote for those people, and also allowing them to run for office. I think this is really important. This is a way to disenfranchise, again, mostly people who've been historically disenfranchised. The prison population is not representative of the population. And so this is, I would say, not allowing people who are formerly incarcerated to vote is a means of vote suppression, quite simply. So I am giving my opinion on some of these. So if you're voting yes on Prop 17, you're voting to restore the right to vote for people who were incarcerated. The next one I think might be of interest to maybe some of the residents' siblings is Proposition 18, and that's voting rights for 17-year-olds. And what that's doing specifically is allowing 17-year-olds to vote in a primary. So what we had back in March, you could vote if you're going to be 18 by the time the general election rolls around. So if your birthday was in June, you turned 18 in June, if this proposition passes, you could have voted in that March primary, and then, of course, vote in the general election once you turn 18. So this is slightly expanding the franchise, as we say, right? Slightly expanding the right to vote. Again, largely supported by Democratic politicians and sort of more progressive liberal community groups, and is opposed by the Republican Party. Then there's one, I didn't have time to do tons of research on this one, but I think this is a particularly salient, really important issue right now in the context of Black Lives Matter, and all of that is Proposition 20. And what that's doing is actually proponents of that proposition want to increase the severity of prison sentences. So what they're doing is they want to start charging what were formerly petty crimes as felonies. So, I don't actually know like sort of what is a petty crime and what's a felony, but basically just really increasing the severity of sentencing. Opponents of this proposition say it would waste, not only is it just kind of out of step with the current movement in terms of rethinking how we deal with prisons, but also that it would really be spending millions of dollars on prisons that could be directed elsewhere, right? Because you'd have people in prison for longer, you'd have more people in prison. So that's Proposition 20. So if you vote yes on Proposition 20, you're voting to increase the severity of sentences in the state.
So if you don't want the severity of the sentences to be higher, you vote no on Proposition 20. That makes sense. I had questions to ask you about some of the early ones, but that's going to be a good thing to. So we discussed 15, we discussed 16, and then then we moved on to 17. And remind me, 17, what was it about precisely?
It's free the vote, so it's restoring the vote to people who were incarcerated.
Right. So this idea do you know if this idea is that people, is it to give the right of vote to people who are currently serving their sentence, or when people are done with serving their sentence, they get out of prison, then they would be allowed to vote?
Yes, that.
So that's the one. So if you're voting yes on 17, that doesn't mean that you're giving the right to vote to prisoners. Maybe you think that prisoners that are currently serving their sentence should also have the right to vote, but that's not what the proposition is about. The proposition is about letting people who've done their time and are now reintegrating society be able to participate in elections again. That's Proposition 17.
Precisely, yeah. As far as I understand it, that's what it is.
Yeah. And then the one about extending, that's kind of my favorite, I'm going to admit, extending the right to 17 years old, because I'm going to remain neutral on all of them except this one, because I've met like so many smart 17 years old in my life, and sometimes not so smart, like 32 years old. And I think that it would be important for the people who are 17. I mean, a lot of our students are young and brilliant. Like, it's difficult for me not to want them to vote, right? Even if they tend to be a little bit older than 17 years old. Yeah, so what's the number of the proposition again?
So that's, funnily enough, Proposition 18. And again, it's not extending the vote to all 17-year-olds, but it's just saying that if you're going to be 18 by November, right, when we have the general election, you can vote in the primaries. So that you can choose who's going to be the Democratic nominee, the Republican nominee. You can choose, all those things.
So that's just it's not even all 17 years old. So if you're voting yes on Proposition 18, you're making it so that people that are a little bit younger will have the opportunity to vote in primaries.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And then the last is Proposition, the fifth is Proposition 20, and that was about, I'm trying to like recount that in my mind.
It's like that game you play at camp where you have to say everybody, No, it's, Proposition 20 is increasing the severity of sentencing.
Okay, so if you want sentences to be tougher, you vote yes on 20. If you don't want to be tougher, you think they're tough enough, maybe even tougher than they should be, then you vote no on Proposition 20. Interesting.
Yeah, and then I'll just mention briefly another one because it's sort of related to these kinds of social justice issues, Prop 25. This one I really didn't look into that much at all, but it's about replacing cash bail with a kind of risk assessment for how likely someone is to reoffend. How that risk assessment is actually, how that risk is assessed, I'm not sure. But cash bail is, I think a way of extracting resources for people who probably don't have a lot of resources. And it's not necessarily the best way of determining whether someone is a risk at reoffending while they're, out awaiting trial or not. Just because you have money doesn't mean you're more or less liable to commit a crime, I would argue. So yeah, that's Prop 25, but I, again, didn't really dig into the details of this one. When I was going through and doing the research and preparation for this, I got kind of excited and added some more, but the ones I'm sort of more familiar with are the ones that I'll be talking more about. So the last one I want to talk about, which I think is probably the trickiest one from my perspective to figure out what's really right, is Proposition 22. And this is rideshare and delivery drivers. I suspect that a lot of our residents have probably seen references to this. There's a ton of ads on Hulu about it. Also, every time you open the Uber app, you get a pretty clear message that they want you to vote yes on Prop 22. So to give a little bit of background, in 2019, California passed a law about whether people were going to be treated as employees or as independent contractors. Independent contractors are people who are, there's a pretty complicated test to figure out if you're an independent contractor or not. I went through it. It was very difficult for me to figure out what my status was. It's about whether you have control over your own time, or if your sort of employer has control over that time. There's a couple of other requirements to be an independent contractor. But what is the main difference between independent contractors and employees are the sort of rights that employees have, right? So they have rights about sick leave, about time off, about wages, other kinds of protections that we in this country extend to employees, right? The employer-employee relationship is a complicated one. And if you're an employee legally, you have certain rights. So this law was passed in 2019 to make Uber, Lyft, and other sort of app-based services treat their workers as employees rather than independent contractors. So that law has passed. That was AB 5, I believe, in 2019. Obviously, something like if you are a company, if you're an app-based company that has these workers, if you're shifting from having them be independent contractors to employees, suddenly you have a much greater responsibility for those people in terms of things like minimum wage, overtime, unemployment benefits, and so on, right? So this proposition is about repealing that law that was passed. So this law was passed really targeting those big app-based delivery systems or ride shares. And as far as I understand it, I mean, Prop 22 is essentially designed by Uber and Lyft. Uber and Lyft have actually been refusing to follow this law since 2019, as far as I understand it. So right now, if you get into an Uber, that person, despite what the law says, is not being treated as an employee. They're being treated as an independent contractor. So Prop 22, which is why it's being so, I think, heavily promoted by Uber and by Lyft, is that, yeah, it would repeal that law and allow them to continue treating their drivers, for example, as independent contractors rather than as employees. This is a pretty divisive measure, I think, for a couple of reasons. I mean, one, if you just look at who's supporting it and who's opposed to it, you know, sort of falling on that dividing line that I've mentioned for a lot of these propositions, where a lot of sort of progressive community groups in the Democratic Party are on one side, and you know, a lot of business associations and the Republican Party are sort of falling on the other side. I think what's difficult about this one is that, you know, there are people who probably want to, who work for Uber and Lyft, who want to continue to be independent contractors. Probably does work for some people for a lot of different reasons. And the proposition does contain some elements like a sort of minimum earning guarantee for new drivers, allegedly. You know, so there's some, Uber and Lyft would be giving up some ground and giving a little bit more protections, a little bit more benefits to their drivers. But ultimately, what they really want is for their business model to continue as is, right? And, you know, I think what makes this one really difficult too is that, to some degree, and I don't want to be hyperbolic, Uber and Lyft and these other app-based sort of businesses are a little bit holding the state hostage, because they do threaten to, and this has happened in other cities, they do threaten to leave entirely, right? So to not operate in California anymore if AB 5 is not repealed, right? So that's a little bit of a bully tactic. But at the same time, you know, if we take them at their word, then a lot of people are going to lose a source of income, you know, people who depend on being a driver. And a lot of people are going to lose sort of relatively affordable, relatively accessible transportation options. You know, public transportation in San Jose is not great. There are places it doesn't go, it's very slow. And so for some people, maybe they really depend on these services. So I think this one's a little bit tricky. I don't know if you two have any questions about it.
Yeah, so just like, so if you vote yes, that means that Uber is going to have to provide benefits, or it's the opposite? It's the opposite.
It's the opposite. So Prop 22 is would allow Uber and Lyft and these other rideshare app things to continue to have their workers be independent contractors,
right? So if
rather than employees.
Proposition 22 doesn't vote, that means that Uber and Lyft and DoorDash, which are the ones who are paying for the ads that you're saying, right? Because they say, the ones I've seen at least, I don't know if you've seen ads for them. So, okay, so if you vote no, that means that they're going to have to provide benefits to their employee. But then I don't know if it's in your field of expertise, Zoe, but would that mean that the prices of those transportation system, like the price of an Uber ride and a Lyft ride, would it go up because Uber would be trying to compensate for the fact that they're providing benefits to their employee?
Yeah, that's right. So that's another issue to consider.
Yeah, okay, so people have to decide whether they want a cheap ride or if they want those services to provide benefits to their employees. So it's kind of a tough situation.
Yeah, and I think, oh, I had something to say and I totally lost my train of thought.
I could jump in really quick.
Yeah.
I think, yeah, this is like certainly a divisive issue, and I really thank you so much for laying these out so eloquently. I think that one thing to think about with Prop 22 is this sort of perspective, because we all enjoy a good deal, we all enjoy a quick ride, and yes, sounds does some things well, but public transportation is certainly an area for improvement. But if we imagine Prop 22 does not pass and Uber and Lyft, raise their ride rates, so let's say now instead of your ride costing $10, it's $15 or whatever. You could be like, oh, man, I'm so angry. This is so expensive. Or you could think, wow, I'm paying for your healthcare, and now you have some benefits, and in case you get sick, you're not left paying everything yourself. So I think that as we think about these issues of privilege and oppression, there are different lenses with which to view things. Certainly, there is the tight economic model of hey, I need an Uber now. This is my priority. This is my prerogative, and that is completely true. I do think it is important to think about the broader picture, about raising people up, about helping our communities. And certainly, while we encourage all of our listeners to act on your own beliefs and your own values, I know that San Jose State aspires to hold all of us responsible for our broader community, and as part of our mission statement as a university to serve our surrounding areas. So I think a very important issue, and certainly one we will be watching closely. Over to you guys.
Yeah, I think that was really well said, Walter, and you reminded me of exactly what my last train of thought was, which is there is a really pernicious element to this bill that for me kind of sways my decision, or proposition rather, kind of sways my decision on it, which is that there's a part of the ballot measure that is, I think, really undemocratic in that it makes it very difficult to ever repeal this and ever try and have more regulation in the gig economy. So for something to be okay, I'm just going to read a little bit of what I did some research here. So the question, it was a resource that I'll tell you guys about at the end of this, but the question was, if Proposition 22 passes, could it be changed later? So it would be very difficult. Proposition 22's text carries language that aims to block further legislative action targeted at gig companies rather. If passed, amending it would require a 7/8 supermajority of the legislature. So usually to amend something, you only require 2/3 of the vote, but 7/8 is very difficult to achieve. So what they're doing is essentially locking in this model of non-employer employee, but company independent contractor relationship, which may work, as I said, may work great for some people, but also may not work great for some people, or maybe there's room for improvement there. But what they're doing with this bill, with this proposition, if it passes, is really trying to lock in this model of work. And I'm a political economist actually by training, and if you guys do a little bit of research into Uber, they are not a profitable company, and they keep their rides artificially low, priced artificially low, to get people to use the service. And again, it makes it a relatively affordable service. But I kind of think if a company can't make a profit and treat its workers well, then it's maybe not a viable business model, right? And what they're doing is really trying to just say this kind of model is here to stay. And we're making it really difficult to change that. I think we should hold those kind of companies now. I'm going off on a diatribe. I think we should just hold them to a slightly higher standard. I know that's difficult to say in Silicon Valley, where these companies employ a lot of people, but that's kind of what I think as a political economist.
Thanks so much, Zoe, for doing that. It raises so many questions. I wish we could discuss for 2 hours, because I'm why would Uber try to keep their prices artificially low. And I'm like, is it because they're trying to make their stock on the stock market go high and something like that? It's just there's an alternative like economical model that we could discuss. Thanks so much. It's like such a hard exercise, I realize, to communicate all this information to residents, and then also to try to do it in a way where you're not just like overly telling people how to vote. You know, I've done my best to kind of like try to keep my political views inside tonight, although I'm inclined to agree with you on like nearly about everything you said. Yeah, I don't know. We had plenty of info about to be about an hour. We have maybe 9 minutes left. Walter, do you have any questions or other points that you like to raise? I want to second Zoe's point, because Zoe and I are both Canadian citizens, but Zoe is also a dual citizen, which means she has American citizenship and she has the right to vote. But I didn't say that. Yeah, but because I'm Canadian, I don't have the right to vote in the United States, right? So ultimately, no matter what I think about all those propositions and who should sit in the White House, I won't get a chance to say it. So after hearing all of this, and that my views are sharper than they were, I really, really wish that I could. Maybe I should introduce my own proposition, which is to let Canadian professors teaching in California to be able to vote in the US elections. I mean, I live in San Jose. I'm going to be impacted by all those things. That's another debate. Maybe everyone who's on a territory and is being affected by law and policy decisions should have a right to participate in an election or something like that. That would be a radical topic. But yeah, Walter, do you have any other question, or Zoe, do you have another information that you'd like to share with the residents before we bring this event to a close?
Yeah, definitely. So I just want to say that I know that I just threw a ton of information at you guys. If you're interested in any of these propositions, or actually interested in some of the candidates on your ballot that you may not have heard of, there's plenty of voter guides sort of floating around. The one I like the most is nonpartisan. I really tried to suppress my views. I don't think it worked, but there's a really great nonpartisan resource for doing your own research called votersedge.org. You can see, by state, and then there's, sort of tabs for the politicians on the ballot, but also the propositions. And what's great about the information, particularly that they provide on the propositions, is that they give you a little overview of what it is. Then they tell you some key arguments from supporters and opponents. And then they also show you what groups are opposing and supporting each measure. And that's where I got a lot of the information that I presented to you guys today. And I think, at the very least, it's kind of a useful shortcut to just look at who's supporting and opposing a proposition. I wouldn't necessarily suggest not doing the research and just doing that, but if you just want to give a quick glance, you can learn a lot about a proposition by looking at who's in favor of it and who opposes it. So I would really strongly suggest, before everyone fills out their ballots, if you haven't done it already, first, please do that soon, but also take a look at Voter's Edge. It's a great resource. Alongside, I think you should have gotten a book, a very thick book that gives information about all the candidates and the ballots and everything or propositions on the ballot. But again, Voter's Edge goes a little bit deeper, presents some more arguments in favor and against. So do check that out.
Yeah, I think it's a really good way to close the event, like to remind residents who are going to be watching this that our function as professors and that people who have PhDs is certainly not to tell you what you should vote in favor of and what you should vote against of. Of course, when we try to remain perfectly neutral, it's really difficult to do because we're normal human beings. We have specific views. We've been thinking about politics for many years, so we have specific values that we're ready to defend. But I think that the right way to end the event is to invite you to do your own thinking and do your own research. That's always what I tell my students in my classes. I'm here to present arguments and to invite you to challenge those arguments. Views are there to be challenged. They're not just there to be agreed with. So if you can go on Voter's Edge, research even one proposition, because life gets busy. It's the middle of the semester. You have midterms. You have papers to write. You may not have 20 hours this week to just do some research about what you're going to vote for. But even if you take the time to get a bit clear on one of those preposition, and it gives you confidence to vote yes or no, then I think that we'll have accomplished what we're trying to accomplish today, and what the university is trying to accomplish generally, because there's multiple initiatives on campus right now that are telling you it's important to go vote. Never forget that no one can force you to believe what you disagree with. You always have this inner freedom. As a philosophy professor, you're always free, you're always autonomous within your mind. And even if people force you to do things, you can know within yourself that you disagree with them. So don't forget that when you stand in front of everything, and ask yourself, what do I really believe in as a young citizen, and then make your decision based on that. That's my little democratic speech.
Wow, Dr. Brown, you're like making me relive 1984 in my head right now. With this, even if they make you do something, you could still believe. I think we may have similar teaching styles. If any of my students are watching, I can tell they can tell you that, much like Dr. Brown said, our goal here is not to tell you what to think, but to teach you how to think. These are the critical lessons that we hope you gain from your university education and from your experience with the residential community. Having this open dialogue, this freedom of expression, this exchange of ideas, this is how your mind grows. It nourishes your academic sort of toolkit, if you will, and helps you figure out what change do you want to make, what priorities do you want to set, what beliefs do you want to share. This is part of the academic experience and part of the beauty of college life. So I think we can all agree that if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. We are resources for you, and the election is only a couple weeks away. So do not miss out on this amazing opportunity to participate in our vibrant democracy, both locally and nationally. I think the only other thing that I had on my list was to mention the upcoming faculty and residence events. And we weekly offer tutoring and community hours for you to engage with us. These are individual appointments where you can talk to us one-on-one. However, if you feel more comfortable in a group setting, we're also happy to coordinate that. So please let us know if you are interested. We have an email that we send out once a week or so, just to give you a friendly reminder where our link is to set up office hours. Mine are from 6 to 9, for example. But all the information will be there in the email, so we won't bombard you with information. Dr. Brown, do you want to briefly mention the cooking events, or should we just send that in an email?
Yeah, well, we can mention it. So we're organizing a cooking workshop for residents, 2 actually, and the first one is going to be held next Monday. We're working on the flyers, and then as soon as we have that, we'll distribute them. And the idea is really going to be to try to help residents maybe that don't have a lot of experience cooking to really cook extremely simple recipes that don't take a lot of time to cook, and that can be cooked with ingredients that are not expensive, and also probably purchase around campus at places like the Vietnamese supermarket that's called Dai Tan, and grocery outlet. So I'm going to send a little bit more information about that. For residents interested, you're going to have the opportunity to join live and cook along. I'm not the one who's going to be doing the teaching demo. We have some SJSU students working with a nutritionist that are going to be doing the demo, but I've promised that I'm going to be trying to keep up with the cooking. So that should be fun. And if some students want to tag along, then I think it's going to be a fun event. And in October, things can get a little bit stressful. If you want to take an hour to just kind of take a deep breath and then switch your mind to off and focus on something entirely different. You might think that it's going to prevent you from doing your work, but I think that you're going to find out when you take an hour or even a day off, the day after, you're just like back on track, and it's much easier to focus. So we look forward to see you then.
All right, we're at 8 o'clock. Thank you for joining us on the YouTube live event, and we really appreciate all your support. Please reach out to us if you have ideas for future topics, because we'll be doing these in the future as well. So take care and have a great night.
A warm thank you to Zoe once more for joining us. I think that you shared extremely precious information, and I'm very happy that you agreed to do this. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I had fun.
Thank you, everyone. Have a nice
Thank you very much.